"Survive one night in my bed, Omega, and your chains will fall." The words rolled through the grand hall like thunder, echoing off stone walls dressed in gold. Every eye turned toward her. The guards tightened their grips on their spears. Somewhere in the shadows, laughter broke like glass, sharp and cruel. She stood barefoot on the cold marble, wrists bound in silver cuffs that gleamed under torchlight. Her heart pounded like it wanted out of her chest, but her chin didn't lower. Not yet. Not when he was watching. The Alpha King sat on his throne, a dark crown carved into the shape of a wolf's jaw resting heavy on his brow. His voice had been low, steady, but the weight of his demand crushed the air from her lungs. One night. In his bed. Freedom, or ruin. The hall smelled of fear, her fear. Silence spread until it felt alive. The court leaned forward, wolves hungry for spectacle. Omegas rarely survived him, and those who tried either died or begged for chains again. Her voice cracked only once, then steadied. "If I survive?" The Alpha King's eyes narrowed, gold in the torchlight. A cruel smile ghosted his lips. "Then the world outside these walls is yours. Fail, and you will learn why they call me king." The crowd gasped. The deal was sealed. She didn't beg. Didn't cry. She only nodded once, an act that was half defiance, half surrender. When the guards led her through the winding corridors, her feet burned against the stone. She counted the steps, each one pulling her closer to the unknown. The palace was vast, alive with whispers. Every servant, every soldier turned to stare. Some pitied her. Some sneered. Most were eager to see her broken. The chamber doors loomed high, carved with wolves tearing at chains. Her chains. The guard shoved her inside. The doors slammed shut. Inside the lair. The room smelled of cedar and fire. Shadows danced across velvet curtains, thick rugs, and walls lined with weapons. At the center stood his bed, vast, draped in dark furs. And him. The Alpha King stood by the fire, a glass of wine in his hand, his shirt loose enough to reveal the scars etched across his chest. He didn't look at her at first. He didn't need to. His presence filled the room like a storm. "Take off the cuffs." His voice was soft, but the guard at the door obeyed instantly, unclasping the silver bands before vanishing. Her wrists ached as the cuffs fell, skin raw, but she refused to rub them. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. He turned then, and their eyes locked. For a heartbeat, she saw not just power, but hunger, controlled, caged, waiting. "You thought freedom would be simple?" he asked, circling her slowly. "It never is. Freedom is earned, Omega. Tonight, you earn it from me." Her throat tightened. She wanted to spit back, to tell him she didn't want his bed, his tests, or his cruel games. But freedom lay at the edge of this night, and she could not afford pride. "And if I refuse?" she whispered. He stopped behind her, so close that his breath touched her ear. "Then the chains stay. Forever." Her body stiffened, but she didn't step back. She wouldn't give him that power. Hours passed with no touch. No command. No claim. He poured wine into a second glass and set it beside her. He ate bread and fruit by the fire and offered her none. He spoke little, but when he did, the words were meant to cut. "Do you tremble because you fear me, or because you don't trust yourself?" She bit her lip hard enough to bleed but didn't answer. The silence was its own torture. The way he studied her, like she was a puzzle, like he wanted to see which piece would snap first. At some point, his shirt slipped further open, and she saw the scar slashed across his chest. Deep, jagged. A wound that spoke of betrayal. Her curiosity betrayed her. She asked, before she could stop herself. "Who gave you that?" He glanced down, then at her, his eyes sharp as a blade. "The only woman I ever trusted." The words hung heavy, thick with venom. He drained his glass and smashed it against the fireplace, shards scattering like ice across the floor. She flinched, but didn't run. And he noticed. The night stretched thin, the air thick. Every time he moved closer, her breath caught, but he never touched. Every moment was a test: sit, stand, breathe, endure. Her body screamed for sleep, for food, for relief. But she stayed awake, stayed standing, because she knew if she fell, she'd never rise again. Finally, as the fire dimmed to embers, he crossed the room in slow, deliberate steps. She braced herself. He leaned down, his lips so close to her ear that his breath warmed her skin. But instead of claiming her, his voice slid like ice down her spine. "I don't want your body tonight, Omega." Her pulse hammered. He smiled, cruel and soft all at once. "I want to see if you break." Darkness swallowed the chamber. "You think survival means resisting me?" "No, Omega. Survival means outlasting me." The words were still clinging to her skin when the firelight dimmed. She hadn't slept. She hadn't dared. The Alpha King had not touched her once through the long hours of night, but that absence was its own cruelty. He sat in the chair opposite the bed, golden eyes glimmering in the half-dark, steady, unblinking. He studied her as though she were a wild animal brought into his den, and he wanted to know how long it would take before she snapped. The silence pressed harder than chains. Every time her body swayed with exhaustion, his gaze sharpened, daring her to collapse. Her throat burned from thirst, her stomach clawed with hunger, but pride kept her spine straight. She would not give him weakness. "You last longer than most," he murmured at one point, his voice smooth, dangerous. "But even stone cracks if you strike it long enough." She bit her lip, forcing her eyes to stay open. Every blink felt like surrender. And that was when she realized, this night wasn't about his bed, or her body. It was about endurance. It was about games. When the moon bled into pale dawn, he finally stood. The weight of hours collapsed into the sound of his boots crossing the chamber. He poured water into a glass and set it before her. Clear. Cold. Tempting. Her lips ached with thirst. Her hand twitched. But she remembered the wine he had set beside her earlier, untouched, perhaps poisoned, perhaps just another test. "Drink," he said. His tone made it sound less like kindness, more like a command. She met his gaze and shook her head. For the first time, something flickered in his eyes, surprise. He lifted the glass himself, drained it in one swallow, and smirked. "Wise." He motioned toward the bed. "Sleep. You've earned it." The mattress looked like heaven, the furs softer than clouds. Every bone in her body screamed for rest. But she didn't move. She remembered his words, "I want to see if you break." This offer was no gift, it was bait. Instead, she crossed her arms, standing firm even as her knees trembled. "Not while you're watching." The Alpha King tilted his head, amused. "Then you'll stay awake. Until you collapse. Let's see how long your defiance holds." Y'all painted on her skin. The Alpha King had promised freedom. Instead, his mark burned on her neck, binding her tighter than chains. The first rays of light filtered through the heavy curtains of the king's chamber, faint and merciless. She sat at the edge of the bed, clutching the thin sheet around her body though nothing indecent had happened. Her pulse still thundered in her veins from the night's cruel game. He had not touched her flesh the way she feared, or perhaps secretly expected, but he had touched her soul. With one decisive brush of his lips at dawn, his scent now claimed her like a brand of fire. Freedom had been one promise away. But freedom had slipped like smoke between her fingers. Her name, her identity as an Omega, now belonged to him. And she hated that a part of her body seemed to remember the heat of his nearness, even though her heart screamed betrayal. The Alpha King leaned against the carved bedpost, dressed in a dark robe now, his silver eyes unreadable. "You survived," he said, his tone neither cruel nor kind. It was the tone of someone who decided the fate of nations with a shrug. She pressed her lips tight, refusing to give him the satisfaction of words. He noticed. A dangerous smirk ghosted across his face. Don't look at me as though I stole something from you. You walked into my chamber willing to gamble. Gambles have consequences. Her voice cracked but sharpened like glass. You promised me freedom. I promised you a chance at freedom, he corrected, each word deliberate. And you earned survival. That, too, is a prize. Her nails dug into her palms as she trembled. Survival is not the same as freedom. For a moment, his gaze softened. Almost. You'll understand in time. He left before she could answer, his robe swaying behind him, leaving her with the mark burning at her throat and silence screaming in her ears. By the time she gathered herself and stepped into the hall, the palace was alive with murmurs. Servants carried trays of fruit and bread, guards polished their spears, courtiers drifted in silks and velvet like predators in human skin. But their eyes, oh, their eyes, slashed sharper than any blade. Whispers curled around her like smoke. She heard her name in tongues not meant for her ears. The Omega survived. She must have pleased him. No one leaves the Alpha King's bed without paying a price. Every giggle, every smirk, every averted glance pierced deeper than the chains she once wore. It wasn't just survival anymore. It was humiliation. A pair of noble women glided past, their perfume sickly sweet. One leaned toward the other, not bothering to lower her voice. Imagine, an Omega touched by the king. Does he lower himself, or does she climb too high? The other woman laughed, and the sound was like knives scratching marble. Her fists clenched at her side. She wanted to scream, to remind them she had not chosen this. That she had fought, resisted, endured. But to them, truth was irrelevant. To them, she was no more than a scandal-wearing skin. And the king, her so-called judge, was nowhere to be seen. Later that morning, the court gathered in the grand hall. Light streamed down from the towering windows, painting the floor in golden squares. Nobles sat in rows like hungry vultures, waiting for the king to appear. She was made to stand at the side of the hall, near the servants yet set apart, too tainted to belong to either side. That was when he approached. Lord Kale. The courtier with lips that always curled into mockery. A man who thrived on others' shame. He was tall, draped in crimson, his eyes glittering like poison. Ah, he said smoothly, stopping before her. The survivor. The king's chosen toy. Her jaw tightened. Say what you will. I survived on my own terms. Kale's smile widened. On your own terms? My dear, the court believes otherwise. They say he spared you because you amused him. And now, he let his gaze fall deliberately to the mark on her neck. Now you carry proof of belonging. You are no longer an Omega without chains. You are an Omega with his chain. Her throat ached. She wanted to deny it, but the burn of the mark silenced her. Kale leaned closer, his whisper sharp enough to draw blood. You may have won his bed, but not his heart. The words hit harder than any blow. Because deep down, she feared it was true. Her eyes lifted across the hall, and there he was. The Alpha King, stepping onto the dais, his silver eyes cold, his crown heavy with silence. He saw her. He saw Kale whispering poison into her ear. But he said nothing. And silence, she realized, was the deepest betrayal of all. The words rang in her ears as the court bowed to the king. You won his bed, but not his heart. The morning after the court's cruel whispers felt like walking through a storm without shelter. Elara had thought that surviving the Alpha King's chamber would be the end of her torment, that one night of courage would win her freedom. But instead, she woke to find her world more dangerous than ever. His scent still clung faintly to her skin, marking her as something neither slave nor consort, and the court smelled blood in that contradiction. They watched her. They laughed when they thought she couldn't hear. She lived, but only because she gave him what he wanted. An Omega doesn't survive without selling herself. She won his bed, not his heart. Each whisper dug deeper, reminding her that chains weren't always made of iron. Sometimes they were made of words sharp enough to wound the soul. But if the court thought they could crush her, they were wrong. The day's summons proved it. The Alpha King sent no explanation, only an order carried on the cold lips of a servant: "She will stand beside me in council." Her heart faltered when she heard, but she forced her steps forward. If she refused, they would call her coward. If she obeyed, she walked into a nest of wolves. Either way, she was exposed. The great council chamber was nothing like the shadowed intimacy of his bedchamber. Here, sunlight streamed through arched windows, gilding the carved walls and the long table that stretched like a blade between rulers and subjects. Every high-ranking noble was present: betas, strategists, warlords, even the silver-tongued advisors who wore silks but whispered poison. And at the head of it all sat the Alpha King. He wore black trimmed with steel, a crown resting light upon his dark hair, but his presence was heavier than stone. When his eyes lifted to hers, the air thickened. He did not smile, nor soften. He only gestured to the space at his side. The message was clear: she would stand in the open, where every gaze could cut her. Whispers rippled instantly. A slave Omega, standing beside a king. An offense to tradition. A scandal to their pride. Elara forced her chin higher. If she bent now, they would smell weakness. If she let them see her tremble, they would devour her. The council began. Reports of border raids, disputes among packs, trade negotiations, all spoken in tones laced with arrogance, as though the very air belonged to the nobles who breathed it. Elara listened, silent as stone, trying not to drown under the weight of their contempt. But then it happened. A lord from the eastern province, a man with fox-like eyes and a smile that sliced like glass, leaned forward. His gaze swept past the king and landed deliberately on her. "My king," he drawled, "we gather here to speak of treaties and wars. Yet you bring us entertainment." His eyes flicked to Elara like she was less than human, less than wolf. "Shall she pour wine for us too?" Laughter scattered around the table like daggers. Elara's hands clenched. Her heart pounded with fury, but she said nothing. The king did not laugh. His jaw tightened, but he did not rebuke the lord. Instead, his eyes slid sideways to her, cold and assessing, as if to say, "Your move." It struck her then: this was no mistake. This was his game. He had dragged her here not for protection, not to silence the rumors, but to test her. To see if she could withstand the venom of his court. Survive. Always survive. That was the rule. Elara inhaled slowly, letting the laughter echo and die. Then she stepped forward. "No," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the chamber. "I will not pour your wine." The room froze. All eyes turned toward her. Even the king's gaze sharpened, as though he hadn't expected her to actually speak. Elara's pulse thundered, but she pressed on. "I was summoned here by the king himself. If my presence offends you, then perhaps it is not me you mock, but his command." Gasps broke the silence. One noble dropped his quill. Another nearly spilled his goblet. The fox-eyed lord's smirk faltered. "Careful, girl," he hissed. But Elara held his gaze, steady as stone. "I may be Omega, but I am no toy. If you think my chains make me weak, then you've forgotten the first lesson of survival: those who are caged learn faster how to fight." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Then, slow, deliberate, came the sound of a chair scraping. The Alpha King had risen to his feet. His eyes locked on hers, burning with a fire that made her knees weak. But his face was unreadable: pride, rage, desire, danger, all hidden beneath that iron mask. The chamber waited for his verdict. One word, and she would be executed for her boldness. Another, and she would rise higher than any Omega dared dream. He stepped toward her, every motion a predator's grace. The weight of his authority pressed down, suffocating yet intoxicating. His hand lifted, slow, deliberate, and hovered near her cheek, close enough that she could feel the heat of his skin. Then his lips curved into the faintest, most dangerous smile she had ever seen. "You speak boldly," he murmured, low enough for only her to hear, for someone who knows how fragile her place is. Her breath caught. The room leaned closer, desperate for the king's judgment. And then, his voice turned sharp as a blade. "Tell me, little Omega, if you speak in my name before this council, are you ready to bear the consequences of defying me?" The chamber erupted in gasps, and Alara's fate hung suspended on the edge of his words. Every scar has a story. Some are victories. Some are graves. And some are wounds that never stop bleeding. The night was unusually quiet. Not even the restless wolves in the courtyard stirred, as though the moon itself held its breath. She had long since grown used to being awake when she should be sleeping. Sleep in the Alpha King's palace was never peaceful. It was an arena of its own, a place where silence was heavy and shadows watched with sharp eyes. But that night, the silence broke not with whispers, nor threats, nor the mocking of courtiers. It broke with the sound of cloth sliding against skin. She turned, and froze. The Alpha King, whose presence was a storm even when he said nothing, had removed his tunic. For the first time, she saw him stripped of his armor of power. His chest was broad, muscle carved like stone, but it wasn't the strength that caught her, it was the scar. A jagged, merciless scar ran diagonally across his chest, deep and ugly, as though someone had once tried to carve the very life from him. It was not just a wound. It was a declaration, of violence, of betrayal, of survival. Her breath caught. "Who?" He didn't look at her. His back remained straight, his shoulders taut as though bracing for a strike. The king never flinched before anyone. Yet now, in the stillness of his chamber, he seemed made of something more fragile. "Who gave you that scar?" she asked, softer this time, almost afraid of the answer. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't respond. But then, his jaw clenched, and his voice, low and rough, cut through the silence. "My mate." The word struck harder than any whip. Her lips parted in shock. His mate. Every Omega knew the myths of mates, the bonds forged by moonlight, ties deeper than blood, unbreakable even in death. To betray one's mate was unthinkable. To try to kill them, impossible. Yet here was the Alpha King, standing before her, living proof of betrayal's sharpest edge. "She tried to kill me." His voice cracked at the end, and for the first time since she had met him, she heard something human in him. Not power. Not cruelty. But grief. She took a step closer, unsure if she was overstepping the invisible line he drew around himself. The room was heavy with unspoken truths, the kind of weight that could crush a weaker heart. She should have kept her distance. She should have remembered she was still his prisoner, no matter the promises of freedom. But she couldn't. Why? The word escaped her before she could swallow it back. Why would she? He turned then, and the look in his eyes silenced her. It wasn't rage, nor pain. It was something worse, emptiness. "Because I loved her," he said flatly. "And in this world, love is the sharpest blade." Her chest tightened. Betrayal. She had lived her life with its taste, abandoned and chained, treated as if she were less than dirt. But his betrayal was from the one person who should have been his sanctuary. He looked at her as though daring her to mock him, to pity him, to do what the court had done when whispers spread like wildfire years ago. But she didn't. She didn't laugh, didn't recoil, didn't gasp. She simply stood there, her own scars invisible yet no less real. And in that silence, something shifted. For the first time, the Alpha King was not the monster, and she was not the prey. They were two wounded creatures in the same dark forest, staring at each other across a divide of pain. He let out a breath and pulled his tunic back on, as if covering not just his body but his vulnerability. "Don't mistake this for weakness," he warned, his tone hardening again. "This scar doesn't bind me. It fuels me." But she had already seen it. The crack in his armor. The truth that he wasn't unbreakable. She met his eyes, her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. "Maybe that's why you haven't killed me yet. Because you're not as unbreakable as they think." His stare burned into her, dangerous and unreadable. For a heartbeat, she thought he might strike her down for daring to say such a thing. Instead, his lips curved, not into a smile, but into something darker. "You're playing with fire, Omega." "Maybe I already survived the flames," she replied. The silence stretched between them, alive with tension, sharp as the scar across his chest. His eyes softened for a fleeting moment before hardening again. He stepped closer, so close she could feel his breath. And then, with a voice low enough to haunt her, he whispered, "If you remind me of her again, I won't hesitate to finish what she started." The Alpha King had forgotten what laughter felt like. Yet in the hush of the midnight hall, when the Omega's lips curved in defiance and her words struck with unexpected wit, a sound rose from his chest, raw, startled, alive. He laughed. The palace froze. The Chamber of Firelight was supposed to be a place of silence. The council had long ended, and most of the nobles had vanished into the cold corridors, whispering among themselves about the Omega who dared stand at the king's side without chains. Yet she had remained behind with him, half from command, half because she knew her place was no longer fully her own. The king sat on his throne as if carved from it, the flicker of the flames gilding the sharp line of his jaw. He was a man forged from dominance, carrying shadows heavier than armor. The Omega, fragile, marked, branded with his scent, should have kept her head bowed. But she didn't. She lifted her chin, her courage an act of madness. "You brood too much, your majesty," she said softly, though her voice carried in the stillness. "If you keep scowling at shadows, one day they'll start scowling back." For a heartbeat, silence. The guards exchanged glances, each bracing for the snap of the king's wrath. An Omega mocking him? Even jesting? The punishment for such boldness had always been death. But instead of fury, it came, sudden, rough, almost unwilling. A laugh. The Alpha King laughed. It wasn't a hollow chuckle, but something deep and startling, a sound that shook dust from corners long sealed. The entire hall went rigid. Some of the guards dropped their gazes, trembling as though the world itself had shifted. The king had not laughed, not once, since the betrayal that nearly ended his life. His hand lifted, brushing against the scar that crossed his chest, as if even he couldn't believe the sound had escaped him. His amber eyes found her, sharp, piercing, but softened with something dangerous. "You," his voice was low, thick with both warning and wonder. "You dare." Her heart pounded, but she didn't lower her gaze. If she showed fear now, he would retreat into the shell she had accidentally cracked. So she smiled, though her lips trembled. "Perhaps, my king, it's not daring. Perhaps it's only honesty. And honesty is what you demand, isn't it?" The air thickened between them. He should have struck her down for insolence. Instead, he studied her as though she were an enigma more troubling than war itself. And then, the corner of his mouth curved, faint, restrained, but unmistakable. A smile. The Omega's knees weakened, though she forced herself to stand tall. She hadn't expected to survive the night she was dragged to his chamber. She hadn't expected to survive his gaze at dawn. And yet here she was, pulling laughter from a man who was said to have forgotten his soul. But danger was never far. That night, when the hall emptied and even the echoes had faded, he kept her near him. They sat not as equals, but not entirely as captor and prisoner either. The king, with his scar like a curse, spoke little, though his silence felt different now, less a wall, more a question waiting. "Why do you not fear me?" he asked suddenly, breaking the stillness. She startled, but only slightly. "Do you want me to lie, your majesty?" "No," his tone was sharp, commanding. "Lie and I will know." She drew in a breath, then let it go. "I fear you every moment I stand near you. But fear is shallow. It burns quick, like fire to dry leaves. What you make me feel is something heavier." His gaze narrowed. "And what is that?" She almost whispered it. "That you are not as unbreakable as you want them to think." A dangerous stillness filled the room. His hand twitched against the armrest of his throne. For a moment she thought she'd gone too far, that his laughter earlier had been a fleeting accident, and now she'd torn open a wound he would make her bleed for. But he did nothing. He only studied her, his jaw tight, his breath slow. Then, to her astonishment, he leaned back, eyes closing briefly, as though her words weighed both like chains and like freedom. For the first time, she wondered if perhaps her survival wasn't a punishment but a test neither of them yet understood. The palace noticed the change. Servants whispered of it in corridors, nobles muttered of it behind gilded doors. The king's cold mask had cracked, and the fracture had a name. The Omega who had defied him. That evening, when she entered the banquet hall at his side, the court fell into a hush so sharp it sliced the air. She walked carefully, every step a silent war with herself. She was not one of them. She was not noble. She was a marked Omega with no right to stand beside their king. But he did not push her away. He let them see her. He let them question. And then it happened, something so small, yet it shook the palace. She dropped a goblet. The silver cup clattered to the ground, rolling across marble, and the court gasped as though she had insulted the crown itself. A servant scrambled to clean it, but the king raised a hand. "Leave it." His voice cut like steel. He bent, picked up the goblet himself, and set it back upon the table. A simple act. But to a palace bred on dominance and submission, it was treason against order itself. And then, her lips curved, nervous, trembling but stubborn, she smiled at him. He should have crushed it. He should have reminded her who she was. But instead, as though bound by a force even he could not command, the Alpha King smiled back. The court nearly exploded in whispers. A smile from the king. At her. The Omega's chest ached, not with pride, but with the sharp sting of knowing what this meant. She was no longer just surviving, she was changing something she did not yet have the strength to control. That night, when the banquet ended and the halls dimmed, she felt the weight of eyes on her. Not his, someone else's. From the balcony above the courtyard, cloaked in shadow, a figure leaned against the stone rail. Their gaze burned, sharper than envy, darker than hate. In their hand gleamed the hilt of a dagger, its blade catching faint threads of moonlight. They had seen the laughter. They had seen the smile. And they were waiting. As she turned toward her chamber, the cold sensation of being watched prickled her spine. Above, in the darkness, the figure gripped the dagger tighter and whispered into the night. "She won't live long enough to take what's mine." Hook, a king can survive the world's daggers. But when the blade finds her instead of him, his world trembles. The night was meant to be ordinary. The moonlight poured like silver across the palace gardens, calm, almost deceptively peaceful. The Alpha King walked with measured steps, his Omega following behind him at a careful pace. After her unexpected laughter had filled his chamber hours before, he had been unsettled, drawn to her in ways he could not admit even to himself. She had cracked open a silence in him that years of power and cruelty had sealed shut. But peace was fragile in a kingdom of wolves. The scent came first, sharp, metallic, foreign. He turned just as the shadow dropped from the balcony above. The blade caught the moonlight for a heartbeat, a flash of silver death aimed straight for his chest. He moved with instinct, years of battle shaping his reflexes. But he hadn't expected her. The Omega. She stepped into the path of steel without hesitation. The sound of metal piercing flesh shattered the quiet. Her gasp, raw and strangled, broke through the night air as blood bloomed across her side. The Alpha King caught her before she crumpled to the ground, his hands instantly painted red. No, his voice was not the voice of a ruler then. It was not the cold command of a man feared across nations. It was broken, frantic. "Not you." Her eyes fluttered, pain etched into her features, but her lips curved, not into fear, but defiance. "You, still breathe," she whispered. "That's enough." And then her weight slumped against him. The king's roar ripped through the garden, primal and violent. His guards scrambled into the scene too late, steel drawn but useless now. The assassin twisted in the king's grip, struggling, but he was caught, dragged to his knees by the king's furious strength. "Who sent you?" the king demanded, his voice low, shaking with rage. The assassin's lips were already torn from the fight, his eyes dark but amused. He coughed blood, then rasped, "Someone closer than you think." And then he laughed. A hollow, bitter sound. The king's claws pressed at the man's throat, rage warring with the instinct for answers. But before he could kill him, another cough turned into a choking gasp. The assassin's body convulsed, and foam spilled from his mouth. Poison. He was gone before truth could be torn from him. The king flung the body aside, his chest heaving, fury coiling through his veins. He had faced wars. He had survived betrayal. But nothing had ever shaken him like the sight of her, the Omega who should mean nothing, bleeding out for him. He lifted her in his arms, her blood dripping into the soil, the metallic scent filling his lungs. His counsel would say she was disposable. That her kind were born to serve, to be forgotten. But at that moment, the Alpha King knew one thing: he would not lose her. The palace healers worked with urgency. Herbs, poultices, hands trembling as they pressed against the wound. He stood over them like a storm barely restrained. "She will not die," he said, his voice like steel. "If she does, every one of you follows her to the grave." The healers bent deeper into their work, sweat running down their brows. One dared to whisper, "My king." The blade was laced with wolfsbane. The words struck like lightning. Wolfsbane, the poison of wolves, lethal in the right dose, and merciless even in survival. The Omega's breaths came shallow, uneven, her skin pale against the sheets. The king clenched his fists at his sides. He had endured the poison himself once, in another lifetime. It left scars on the soul as much as the body. And yet, she had taken it for him. Why? Why would she throw herself into the path of death for a king who had only bound her in chains of mockery and tests? The answer clawed at him, but he pushed it down. Now was not the time for questions. Now was the time to protect. Hours into night. When the healers left, only silence and the faint crackle of candles filled the chamber. The king remained, seated at her bedside. He had not left her side, nor did he intend to. His eyes traced her still features, her lips slightly parted as if caught in unfinished words. She had been a thorn, a challenge, a spark where there should have been submission. And now, lying here, she was a mirror of something he feared most: loss. He reached for the scar on his chest unconsciously, the mark left by betrayal, by a mate who had once vowed to love him before driving a dagger into his heart. That wound had turned him cold, a king carved from stone. And yet, this Omega, this fragile creature who owed him nothing, had bled to shield him. His hand hovered above hers but did not touch. His pride, his fear, his walls, they all warred with the need that burned in his veins. Finally, his voice broke the silence, a whisper almost too soft to belong to a king. "You should have let it be me." Dawn breaks. By morning, word had spread through the palace like wildfire. The Omega had saved the Alpha King. But tongues are crueler than blades. In the courtyards and corridors, whispers hissed, "She staged it. He grows soft. An Omega has bewitched him." Some laughed in mockery, others schemed in silence. And in the king's council chamber, murmurs grew louder. "A weakness," one elder said. "Your enemies will smell blood. They will not fear a king who shields an Omega." The king's eyes turned sharp, dangerous. "They will fear me more than ever. Because now, they will learn what happens when someone touches what is mine." The word slipped before he could stop it, "Mine." The council fell silent. But somewhere in the shadows of the hall, unseen eyes watched and listened. The same eyes that had ordered steel to fall upon him in the garden. And now, seeing the king's fury for her, a darker thought took root. If the Omega was his weakness, then the Omega must be destroyed. The Omega stirred at last, her eyelids heavy, her voice a whisper. "Why do you look at me like that?" The king leaned closer, his jaw tight, his hand hovering just above hers again. And then he whispered, words as sharp as they were trembling. "Because the next blade won't touch you. Not while I breathe. But from the shadows of the doorway, unseen, the rival who wanted her gone was already smiling. The game had only just begun. Protection, she spat, slamming her fist against the gilded bars of his chamber. This is not protection. This is a cage. The Omega had thought she knew chains, iron ones that bit into her wrists, ropes that burned against her skin. But the Alpha King had outdone them all. His cage was carved in luxury, silken sheets, golden mirrors, velvet curtains that swallowed sound, and guards stationed outside the door who bowed only to him. It should have felt like freedom. Instead, it stank of control. He had ordered her confined here after the assassination attempt in the garden. Her blood had barely dried when his decree fell like an axe. You will not leave my sight again. At first, she thought it was grief, fear disguised as fury. His roar had shaken the palace walls when he carried her bleeding in his arms. But now, staring at the thick locks on the chamber door, she understood. His fear was real. Yet so was his hunger for power, and power had no patience for her fragile independence. She paced. The rugs were soft, but each step echoed like iron shackles. Outside, the palace went on, war councils, alliances, whispers of enemies gathering in the north. And she was locked in velvet silence, reduced once again to an object hidden away. When the king finally entered, his presence burned through the air like storm fire. He had shed his ceremonial robes for armor, dusted with ash from the training grounds. His jaw was clenched, his scarred chest rising with each measured breath. She didn't bow. Not anymore. You promised me freedom, she said, her voice steady though her heart raced. And instead, you've wrapped me in silk and called it mercy. His golden eyes narrowed. You were nearly killed. You were the target. Her voice sharpened. I stepped in front of that blade, not so you could lock me in your chamber like a pet. Do you think walls will keep death from you? From me? His hand twitched near his sword, but it wasn't anger, she saw hesitation there, the battle he waged against himself. He looked at her the way predators look at fire, mesmerized, but wary of being burned. You think this is a prison, he said finally. But I call it a sanctuary. I cannot fight a war and watch you bleed again. And I cannot love a man who mistakes control for care. The words left her before she could swallow them. His silence was heavier than his rage. The king of alphas, breaker of armies, stared at her as if she'd carved his chest open with her bare hands. Then, as if to remind her who truly held the power, he turned without another word and crossed to his desk. Papers rustled, maps spread, and his signature scrawled across a decree. She stood frozen, her breath shallow, until his hand slipped. A folded parchment slid to the edge of the desk and fluttered to the floor. She bent to pick it up, her fingers brushing the seal before he could stop her. His sharp inhale was too late. The wax bore the crest of another alpha house. And inside, her stomach turned, the words were plain as day. Betrothal treaty. To bind the Alpha King to the daughter of House Vaynar. For strength. For power. For heirs. Her throat closed. The paper trembled in her grip. When she looked up, his gaze was already on her. Not furious. Not apologetic. Just, unreadable, like a storm that hadn't yet chosen whether it would rain or destroy. So this is the truth, she whispered. While you keep me caged, you plan to wed another. His jaw flexed, but he didn't deny it. Her chest cracked open with something rawer than heartbreak. Betrayal. She had been foolish enough to believe his laughter, his scar confessions, his tender silence when he thought she was asleep. She had thought the bond was growing, fragile but real. But here, laid bare on his desk, was proof that she was still what she had always been, disposable. The Omega who survived his bed. The Omega who amused him. The Omega he could cage. Her fingers crumpled the letter as she stepped back. You don't want me, she said, her voice breaking despite her will. You want leverage. You want an heir. And I was just practice. He strode forward, his hand closing around her wrist before she could turn. His touch was fire, but her body no longer trusted the warmth. "You think I would let another woman touch me after what we've shared?" His voice was low, dangerous, but trembling with something she couldn't name. "That treaty is politics. A cage of my own. You are not disposable." "Then why keep secrets?" she demanded. "Why lock me away instead of letting me choose whether I stay?" The silence stretched. He released her slowly, as if her skin burned him now. And in that silence, she knew, he had no answer that would save them both. That night, as she sat curled in the golden cage he called a chamber, her fingers brushed over the crumpled letter again. Only this time, she noticed something she hadn't before. At the bottom of the treaty, in faint ink, was a second seal. Not just the crest of House Vaynar, but the mark of betrayal, the very same crest carved into the assassin's blade. Betrayal does not always wear the face of an enemy. Sometimes it hides behind the lips that once whispered your name like a vow. The palace halls had gone too quiet. The kind of silence that suffocated, wrapping around her throat until even her breath felt like a crime. Evelyn sat curled against the edge of the Alpha King's bed, clutching the letter she'd found in his desk. The ink was dark, deliberate, signed with his own mark, plans to wed another Alpha house. His name and hers written together in a pact of alliance, as though she had never existed. Her vision blurred, but she forced herself to read it again. And again. Each word carved itself into her chest like a blade. Was she nothing more than a distraction? A pawn dressed in scars and obedience? Her fingers trembled, crushing the parchment. All those moments she thought were real, the softness of his voice when he asked if she was afraid, the way his laughter sounded like breaking chains, the nights when his hand lingered too long on her cheek, had they been rehearsed? She remembered the scar across his chest, the raw truth he had whispered about betrayal. And now, here she was, living the echo of his wound. The door opened behind her. Cale entered, shoulders broad, eyes sharp with exhaustion from the council chambers. He carried the weight of kingship like a second skin, but when his gaze found her, some of that armor cracked. "You haven't eaten," he said, his tone clipped but not unkind. Evelyn rose slowly, the letter hidden in her fist. Her lips parted, but the words stuck like thorns. She had always fought him in silence first, letting her eyes speak where her tongue failed. Tonight was no different. Cale frowned. "What is it?" She wanted to scream. To throw the letter at his face. To claw at the truth until it bled. But when she finally spoke, her voice was not anger, it was colder, sharper. "Am I your prisoner, or just your entertainment until the real queen arrives?" His body stilled. "What did you say?" She opened her hand and let the crumpled letter fall between them. It landed at his feet like a corpse. Cale's jaw tightened. He did not move to pick it up. "You went through my desk. That's all you have to say?" she snapped, her chest heaving. Not a denial, not an explanation, just another order I broke. The silence stretched, thick with something she could not name. His pride was his cage, and tonight it locked him tighter than chains. "I don't owe you answers," he said finally, each word clipped like a blade. Her heart cracked. "Then you've answered everything." She pushed past him, her bare feet silent on the polished floor. He did not stop her. He didn't even turn. And that hurt more than if he'd shouted. That night, while the moon wore its silver crown, Evelyn stood at the edge of the palace gates. She wore only a plain cloak stolen from the laundry halls, her hair tucked beneath its hood. Every step felt like walking barefoot on glass, but pain was better than being forgotten in silk. The guards at the gate were tired, lulled by routine. She moved like shadow, silent, steady. Her heart hammered, but the rhythm of desperation steadied her hand. Just a few more steps. Freedom was so close she could almost taste the night air beyond these cursed walls. But then... Stop! The command was sharp, final. A spear tip glinted in the moonlight, inches from her chest. Two guards emerged from the shadows, their eyes narrowing when they saw her face. Recognition flared. One reached for her arm. "Lady Evelyn," he muttered. "Where are you going at this hour?" "Let me pass," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please. I'm not your enemy." But loyalty to a king was carved deeper than pity. Rough hands seized her arms, pulling her back, dragging her from the edge of freedom. She twisted, fought, but her strength was nothing against theirs. The palace swallowed her again, its gates slamming shut like a beast's jaw. When Kale entered the great hall, his soldiers already had her on her knees. Her cloak was torn, her wrists bound. He stopped at the sight, his expression unreadable, though his eyes burned with something dark. "You would run," he said quietly, almost to himself. Her head snapped up. "Wouldn't you? If you discovered the man who chained you also planned to betray you?" The soldiers shifted uncomfortably. No one dared speak. Kale descended the steps slowly, each movement deliberate. He stopped before her, towering, his shadow swallowing hers. "You think you know betrayal," he said, voice low, dangerous. "But you know nothing of war, of oaths, of blood." Her tears came hot and fast, but she did not bow her head. "Then teach me, king. Teach me why my heart had to be the price of your throne." The room was silent. Even the fire in the torches seemed to hold its breath. Kale reached for her face, his touch almost gentle, but then he pulled back as though burned. "Take her to the east wing," he ordered. His voice was iron again. "No one enters without my leave." The guards obeyed. As they dragged her away, she caught one last glimpse of him, stone-faced, unreadable, yet his fists clenched so tightly the scars across his knuckles reopened. The east wing was no dungeon, but it was colder. Isolated. A gilded cage with walls too wide to touch. For days, she did not see him. No words, no visits. Only silence and the echo of betrayal. And yet, at night, when she pressed her ear against the heavy door, she swore she could hear him on the other side. Breathing. Waiting. Guarding. It was its own kind of torment. Her thoughts spiraled. Was his silence proof of guilt, or of something else? Was she wrong to leave? Or wrong to stay? The wound of doubt festered deeper than any chain. On the fourth night, the lock clicked. Kale stepped inside, his face shadowed, his scent sharp with rage and exhaustion. But before he could speak, Evelyn whispered the words that cut him deeper than any blade. "I don't love you anymore." For the first time, the Alpha King's mask cracked, and she saw fear flicker in his eyes. She thought the whip of his fury would lash her soul. Instead, he gave her a whisper so tender it burned more than chains. The palace gates were supposed to be her salvation. The night air had filled her lungs like stolen freedom, her bare feet pounding against the earth as she fled. She had run with everything in her, the Omega who had dared to dream of a life outside gilded cages. But the iron hands of his guards had been quicker, merciless, dragging her back as though the shadows themselves obeyed the Alpha King's will. Now she stood before him again. The great hall was empty save for the torches lining the walls, their flames bending as though afraid of his stillness. He sat on the throne like carved obsidian, silent, unreadable, his gaze locked on her as the guards forced her to her knees. Her wrists ached from the grip of steel, her body trembling from exhaustion. Yet her chin did not fall. Not this time. If this was to be her punishment, execution, ridicule, or another chain, she would face it unbroken. The silence stretched like a blade at her throat. Finally, with a single flick of his fingers, the guards released her. Their heavy steps echoed as they withdrew, leaving only the two of them in the cavernous chamber. The air thickened. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he rose from his throne, descending each step with the slow inevitability of a predator stalking its prey. His scent, dark pine, smoke, and the faint metallic tang of dominance, wrapped around her until it was all she could breathe. She braced herself for the roar, for the strike, for the Alpha King's wrath that would remind her she was nothing but his marked possession. But instead, "I should have let you go." The whisper cracked through the silence. Her heart jolted. She lifted her head, meeting his eyes, and for the first time she saw something breaking behind their steel, something raw, almost human. "You would have been safer outside these walls," he murmured, stopping before her. "Away from daggers meant for me. Away from games you were never meant to play." His words cut sharper than any chain. Safer away from him. That was what he meant. He had dragged her into this palace, marked her with his scent, branded her as his, only to stand here and say she should have been free. Her lips trembled, but pride held them steady. "Then let me go now," she said, voice low but firm. "If your regret is real, then release me. You do not need me." His jaw tightened. Need is the very problem. Before she could answer, his hand reached for her. Not to strike. Not to drag. But to cup her face with a gentleness that undid her bones. His thumb traced the hollow of her cheek, rough calloused skin against fragile flesh. And then he kissed her. Not the searing dominance of an alpha claiming. Not the calculated cruelty of a king testing obedience. But soft. Desperate. Like a man clutching a fleeting miracle. Her body betrayed her, leaning into the warmth, into the taste of him that melted fire and sorrow into one unbearable sweetness. For a moment, she let herself drown. But just as quickly, he pulled away. His breath was ragged, his chest rising and falling as though the kiss had cost him his throne. His hand lingered at her jaw for half a heartbeat longer, then dropped like it burned him. "Do not mistake this," he rasped, turning his back to her. "I am not a man you can love. And you are not a woman I can keep." The words shattered her like glass. Her lips still burned from his kiss, but his rejection was colder than chains. Her heart pounded in chaos, torn between fury and ache. "If that is true," she whispered, forcing herself to her feet despite the trembling in her knees, "then why did you mark me? Why cage me? Why kiss me as if your soul depends on it?" He froze. His back remained turned, but his shoulders were tense, every muscle a battlefield between denial and confession. "Because," he said finally, his voice breaking into the silence, "you remind me of everything I lost." The words sank like poison into her veins. His scar. His mate. The betrayal. She had always known there were ghosts that haunted him, but now she realized she was living in their shadow. He faced her again, eyes storm-dark, jaw clenched as if holding back a flood. "Do not ask me to explain further. The moment I do, I will destroy you too." Her breath caught. He was right. The palace was filled with enemies. The assassin's dagger had already found her once. His rival houses waited for any sign of weakness. Loving him was not just dangerous, it was death itself. Yet her chest still ached for him. For the man who had whispered he should have let her go. For the Alpha King who kissed her like he had forgotten how to breathe. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "And if I choose to stay, even knowing it may destroy me?" His eyes burned into hers, fire and torment and hunger bound in one unyielding stare. "You won't survive me," he said. "But God's help me. I don't want to watch you leave." The chamber fell into silence again, but it was no longer the silence of chains. It was the silence of something dangerous, something forbidden, something fragile blooming where it should never take root. And just as the tension thickened to breaking point, the doors burst open. A council messenger stumbled inside, breathless. "Your Majesty! The rival houses, there is movement at the borders. They claim an Omega rebellion stirs." The king's head snapped toward the intruder, fury flashing. But behind that fury, her heart sensed it, a storm coming, one that would test every chain, every scar, every whisper between them. He turned back to her, eyes burning not with anger, but with possession. "You wanted freedom? Then stand beside me. Because they will come for you first. Desire can't be hidden, no matter how carefully it is buried. When hearts burn in silence, the fire only grows wilder, until the world itself feels its heat." The night after he kissed her, softly, desperately, then pushed her away, was unlike any other. For the first time, the Omega couldn't sleep. Her lips still burned with the memory, and her heart warred with her mind. Why would he kiss me only to cast me off? She wondered, clutching the thin sheets to her chest. Why show me tenderness if I am nothing but a prisoner, nothing but a distraction? Yet she could still feel it, the tremor in his hands, the quiet desperation in his breath. That was not the kiss of a man seeking to prove dominance. That was the kiss of someone terrified of losing what he never thought he could want. Across the palace, the Alpha King sat in silence at his writing desk, quill still in hand though he hadn't written a single word. His chest ached where the memory of her lingered. He had kissed her. Him, the king of wolves, who had sworn never to bow to desire again, who had buried all softness the day his mate betrayed him. But her, that fragile, defiant Omega with eyes that burned brighter than chains could contain, she had undone him. He pressed a hand over his scar, the jagged reminder of betrayal, and whispered into the empty room, "You'll be my ruin." When dawn came, the palace was abuzz with whispers. Servants noted how the Omega walked with her head bowed yet her cheeks flushed. Others noted how the king's gaze lingered on her longer than it should during council. And though neither spoke of the kiss, a dangerous tension grew between them. Every glance, every near touch, every breath. It was as if an invisible thread tied them together, pulling tighter with each passing moment. The king began summoning her to his chamber not with orders, but with excuses, discussing the garden layout, asking her thoughts on a council petition she shouldn't even hear, keeping her near under the guise of protection. And though she often argued, "I am not your shadow, nor your caged bird," she stayed. Because part of her feared what would happen if she left. One evening, as a storm raged outside, the king found her standing near the balcony, her dress whipping in the wind, her hair loose like fire in the dark. "You'll catch your death out here," he said, stepping closer. She didn't turn. Maybe freedom is worth it. His jaw tightened. Even if freedom means death. Finally, she faced him. Better that than living as a pawn in your court. Better that than being your possession. Her voice should have angered him. Instead, it made his chest ache with something unfamiliar, something dangerous. He reached for her wrist, his grip firm but trembling. "You are not a possession. Then what am I to you?" The words slipped between them like lightning. For a heartbeat, he didn't answer. Then, as thunder shook the skies, he leaned in, not with the cruelty of a king, but with the hunger of a man starved of touch. Their lips collided again, fiercer this time, unrestrained. Her hands pressed against his chest, not in resistance but in need, and his grip shifted to her waist, pulling her closer as though he would never let go. The fire they had buried consumed them both, wild and unyielding. Unspoken, fragile, dangerous. But fire is dangerous when left untamed. When at last they parted, breathless and shaken, silence pressed heavy between them. The Omega's eyes searched his, desperate for the truth he refused to speak. "I cannot," his voice cracked, breaking. "I cannot give you what you seek." Her heart clenched. "Then why kiss me? Why let me burn with you?" But she said nothing. Because part of her feared the answer. From that night, desire lingered in every glance, every near touch, but words never followed. They danced on the edge of something fragile, dangerous, and unspoken. The king grew more restless. The Omega grew more doubtful. And the palace walls whispered louder than ever. It happened in the most humiliating way. The council had gathered in the great hall to discuss alliances, taxes, and border wars. The king presided at the high seat, his expression carved in stone. The Omega was not meant to be there. Yet she stood at his side, summoned with no explanation. The courtiers exchanged glances, shocked, insulted, scandalized. An Omega beside the throne? Whispers echoed through the chamber. She bewitched him. She curses the throne with her presence. He risks the entire court for a slave's touch. The king ignored them. His eyes never left her. But in his silence, the council found strength. Mid-discussion, one of the oldest lords slammed his fist on the table. "We will not sit and watch our king's judgment falter because of her." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. The king's aura flared, silencing most, but not all. The Omega stepped forward. "If you doubt his judgment, then challenge me, for I am not afraid to stand where he stands." The room froze. Her voice was steady, her chin lifted, her defiance cutting through centuries of tradition. An Omega had no right to speak in council, let alone challenge them. But she had, and no one could ignore it. The silence cracked with venom. "She curses the throne," another counselor spat. What other reason could there be for his madness? Only dark sorcery would make a king forget his duty for a worthless Omega. Gasps echoed. Heads turned. Even the guards shifted uneasily. The king rose to his feet, his fury shaking the very walls. "Watch your tongue." But before he could finish, the doors burst open. More lords stormed in, their robes flaring, their faces twisted with accusation. They had seen it, her hand lingering too close to his, her breathless flush in his presence, the way his gaze softened only when it fell on her. The evidence was clear. The council pointed at her with one voice: "She has cursed the throne." The king's hand went to his sword, his eyes burning with unrestrained power. The Omega's breath caught, her heart racing as she stood accused before an empire. But then, just as his fury was about to explode, the council doors slammed shut behind them, trapping all inside. And for the first time, the king looked not at his enemies, but at her. "Stay close to me," he whispered, the fire in his voice unyielding. Because whether curse or not, whether slave or savior, she was now bound to him before the entire kingdom. The council storms in mid-embrace, accusing her of cursing the throne. The chamber walls trembled with fury. In the council's eyes, she wasn't an Omega anymore, she was a curse wrapped in flesh. A witch who dared touch the throne. The air split with shouts, sharp and venomous. The council stormed into the king's private chamber, their robes flaring like wings of judgment. Torches hissed against the stone, shadows leaping across their lined faces. Their voices were knives, tearing at the silence that had just been filled with something fragile, something dangerous, the Alpha King's arms around her. "Blasphemy," one councilman roared, pointing an accusing finger at her. "The Omega dares defile the throne with her filth." "She is no innocent," another spat. "She bewitched you, my king. Look at you, weak, undone, falling into disgrace." Her body trembled, but she stood tall, refusing to shrink. She had endured worse than words. But the sight of the king, his jaw clenched, his eyes burning, unsettled her more than their rage. The Alpha King did not rise. He did not shout. He simply straightened, his broad shoulders cutting an immovable figure against the chaos. His silence was more dangerous than any roar. "She has cursed the crown," a third voice thundered. "The throne will wither if she is not purged. We demand her execution at dawn." The words struck her chest like a hammer. Execution. Not banishment. Not punishment. Death. Her lips parted, but the king lifted one hand, barely, subtly, stilling her before she could speak. His gaze never left the council. Execution, the word slipped from his mouth like a storm gathering. "Yes," the elders chorused, emboldened. "The law demands purity. No Omega may touch the king's flesh. She has tainted you. She must burn." The king's fingers flexed against the throne. For the first time in years, his face showed something raw, unguarded, fear. Not for himself. For her. Her knees weakened, but pride held her upright. Her mind raced. Had she been a fool to believe even for a heartbeat that she was more than a pawn, more than the ridicule spat at her since birth? The chamber grew hotter with every voice raised against her. She felt stripped, judged, laid bare under their hatred. And then, silence. The Alpha King rose. His height swallowed the chamber, his presence crushing even the loudest among them. He descended the steps with measured strides, every footfall echoing like thunder. He stopped before her, his shadow consuming hers, his hand brushing hers for the briefest, forbidden second. And then he turned to the council. "If she dies," his voice was low, dangerous, echoing across the stone, "I die with her. The chamber erupted. Gasps tore from throats. Shouts overlapped. But his words could not be swallowed back. They were iron, already bound to fate. "You dare," one councilman began, but his voice broke under the weight of the king's glare. "She is no witch," the king continued, his tone colder than steel. "She is mine. And if you call her curse, then you call me curse too." The Omega's heart thundered in her chest. The words, "mine," burned hotter than fire. But beneath the heat was terror. He had just declared war with his own council, for her. "Your Majesty," an elder rasped, trembling with outrage, "you cannot bind the throne to an Omega. You shame the bloodline. The other houses will never accept this." "Then let them choke on their refusal," the king snapped. "I am Alpha King. My word is law." But for all his ferocity, she saw it, the flicker in his eyes, the faint tremor in his hand. He was daring the impossible, standing against centuries of law and tradition, against his own kingdom. And she was the reason. The council's voices rose again, a storm of fury and disbelief. She barely heard them. Her ears rang with the sound of her own heartbeat, with the memory of his words. "If she dies, I die with her." The trial did not end that night. It only began. They dragged her from his chamber, chains biting into her wrists, the council's decree echoing down the corridors, "The Omega will stand trial at dawn." She stumbled through the palace halls, torchlight glinting off the iron around her. Behind her, the king's voice thundered still, demanding her release, but his guards obeyed the council's command. His crown may have made him king, but tradition ruled deeper than any one man. The cell they threw her in smelled of damp stone and blood long dried. Her knees hit the floor, but she clenched her jaw, refusing to give them her tears. Through the barred window, the moon cut across her face. She whispered into the dark, though no one could hear, "Why me? Why now?" But the echo of his words replayed in her mind, steady as a vow, "If she dies, I die with her." And though the cell chilled her bones, a flicker of warmth dared spark in her chest. At dawn, the trial began. The great hall brimmed with bodies, lords, nobles, alphas from allied houses. They had come to witness the spectacle, the fall of a nameless Omega who dared touch the king's heart. Chains dragged across the floor as she was forced to her knees in the center. Her head bowed, but her spirit, though trembling, did not bend. Accusations flew like arrows. She bewitched him. She defiled the crown. She is a danger to the kingdom. The council's voices blended into one deafening roar. Then silence cut through again. The Alpha King had entered. His boots struck the stone as he strode forward, not to the throne, but to her. He stood between her and the council, his back a shield, his voice a blade. "You call her curse," he growled. "Then curse me as well. But hear me now, if she falls, I burn your halls to ash." Gasps filled the chamber. Never had a king defied his council so openly. Never had he tied his fate to an Omega so completely. Her chest ached. The world blurred. She wanted to scream at him, to beg him to stop before he destroyed himself. But no sound left her lips. And then, his hand brushed hers, hidden, fleeting, but enough. Enough to tell her she was not alone in the shadows of their judgment. The council leader slammed his staff against the floor. His voice rang like thunder. "Then so be it. If you choose the witch, you choose war." The chamber erupted, nobles shouting, factions clashing. And through the chaos, his voice rose above all. "Then let it be war." The Omega's breath caught in her throat. The trial was no longer hers alone, it was the kingdom's. When a king places his heart above the crown, the walls of power begin to tremble. The silence that followed his words was not silence at all, it was the sound of history breaking. "If she dies, I die with her." Those words still hung in the chamber like smoke clinging to fire, staining every wall, every ear, every sworn oath ever made. The council had been split clean down the middle, those whose jaws clenched in horror, and those who whispered in disbelief. And in the very center, the Alpha King stood, unshaken, his hand curled so tightly around the armrest of his throne that would splintered beneath his grip. The Omega sat on her knees beside him, wrists still bound in iron. Her lips parted in shock, but no words escaped her. She had never asked for his defense, never begged for his love in return. And yet here he was, shattering centuries of royal law for her. The murmurs grew into a storm. This is treason against the crown. He is bewitched. No king has ever fallen so low. He binds his fate to an Omega. She is nothing. The king's voice cut through them, low and lethal. She is everything. The words made her chest tighten with something she refused to name. But then, the impossible happened. A figure moved through the uproar, a man draped in crimson armor, his presence enough to silence the bickering voices. His boots struck the marble floor with the rhythm of thunder. When he stopped, it was at the foot of the throne. His head lowered, his hand gripped the hilt of his blade. It was General Kale. The king's most trusted brother-in-arms. The man who had bled with him through wars, who had raised his banner when no one else dared, who had been called the shield of the throne.